though it's a bit presumptuous on my part, just being alongside such illustrious men and women of science, public intellectuals, all of them, but I shall fulfill my mandate. I was thinking of launching an attack on pseudoscience, and I was wondering what pseudoscience to attack. I briefly thought of homeopathy. I thought of Ayurveda. And the thing about pseudoscience is that to the uneducated and untrained mind, pseudoscience sounds like science. And the question we must ask is that, is there something pernicious about pseudoscience? As Jefferson said, if something doesn't pick my pocket or break my bones, I don't have a problem with it. But I do. So I'm going to actually read from a text. This is a slightly amended version of something I'd written a while back.
Just pick up my phone.
And here goes. The detached placenta reeks of caked blood. It has the sultry, damp, slightly animal smell of the birth canal and the pickled herring notes of the liquor that bathes the unborn child, but mostly the smell of blood. The word placenta comes from the Latin for cake, and that's exactly what it is. A marbled, bloodlocked cake made from fetal and uterine tissues. In the third stage of labor, it cleaves very beautifully out of the womb, bidden by a slow drag on the umbilical cord into the hands of the obstetrician. In a planned caesarean section, when the uterus is sliced open, there are no stages of labor. The afterbirth behaves differently. The placenta behaves differently. Without the womb bearing down on it, the placenta, on the odd occasion, has to be drawn out. If it's a repeat caesarean, the blood cake attaches itself to the previous uterine scar. If there's been a previous caesarean section, this placenta attaches itself to the previous uterine scar. And like a burrowing organism, it invades the muscles of the womb, sometimes even going into the adjacent urinary bladder. Faulty placentation, as it's called, is a form of morbidly adherent placenta that has to be prized out, torn from the uterine fabric.
Just a moment, since we are recording it.
Faulty placentation, as it's called, is a form of morbidly adherent placenta that has to be prized out, torn from the uterine fabric. There's no other way of doing it. After it's ripped out, the uterus bleeds incontinently, like a breached dike. And every time it happens, even the old stagers and the grandmasters of these surgical campaigns, very, very experienced obstetricians, they're transfixed by how much and how unrelievedly an organ can bleed. As I stood over one such bloody surge across a white-knuckled obstetrician, desperately, blindly, hopelessly trying to oversew the bleeding uterus, I thought about the stars and the alleged power they have over human mammals. As a vascular surgeon, I'd been called in to ligate the internal iliac arteries to decrease the blood supply to the uterus. A 34-week fetus with premature lungs had just been pulled out and sent gasping and grunting to the neonatal intensive unit. It was all done in a favorable planetary period, when the ascendant and the seventh house were free from afflictions, when the Navamsha was exalted, the moon was well placed and disposed to bestowing favors. This was a Mahurat caesarean section. A Shastri had been consulted by the family for an auspicious time for caesarean that day. A narrow window of 45 minutes was given to them. The ascendant in Navamsha would change after that, they were told. The infant survived for 4 weeks, after 4 weeks in the ICU. The infant survived. But all the money and all the benignity of the planets couldn't save the woman's uterus. With about a third of the first pregnancies in urban India being delivered by caesareans, the rate of morbidly adherent placenta has increased from about 1 in 30,000 in 1930s to about 1 in 2 to 3,000 in the last decade. About 50% of these cesareans are planned electively for medical indications, but scores are done on maternal request. Quite a few of these elective cesareans will be done at a time chosen by an astrologer. To the believer in astrology, the fetus in the pregnant uterus is a slightly modified equivalent of Schrödinger's cat. But in the believer's head, there is no randomness involved. It's as though there's an invisible Geiger counter inside the uterus that holds the promise of either fructifying or poisoning the life of the yet unborn. As long as the uterine box is closed, it can go either way. The time of unboxing determines everything. The moon, the other grahas, the nakshatras, the mahadashas all control the Geiger counter. The time of birth grants the infant, for all its life, an obligatory adherence to destiny. That's what the believer believes. There lies the importance of the Muhurat Caesarean. Now, should one deride and laugh at something that people seek meaning from? Is the story in the birth chart a fairy tale? Are astrologers obscurantist hucksters, or do they make pronouncements from some ancient scriptural stock of empirical knowledge? And with all this blather about planetary magnetic energy being suggested as a possible mechanism of action, does Jyotish Shastra suffer from a sort of physics envy? By virtue of being classified as one of the auxiliary disciplines that serves to assist and abet Vedic rituals, any criticism of Vedic astrology is always perceived as a criticism of the Hindu religion. But for a systematic enterprise that calls itself Shastra and Vidya, science and knowledge, can the claims of Jyotish Shastra even be called empirical? To apply the test of inductive reasoning, any claim would have to be based on a series of observations. Different areas in the horoscope reportedly govern different areas of an individual's life. The first house, or the lagna, governs the individual's body and health. The second house rules over speech and the oral cavity as well as wealth. Rahu in the lagna renders the subject ever ailing. The subject is talkative, red-eyed, a sinner, ever engaged in forbidden activities, and adept in courageous deeds. It also confers cruelty and ugliness on the incumbent. This is from the text called Manasagiri. Rahu in the second house confers on the incumbent unclear speech and speech with hidden meaning. It makes one a thief, ever haughty, and given to intense suffering. These individuals have a quarrelsome nature, deal in animal skins and the sale of fish, have access to a lot of wine and flesh, don't know what's wrong with that, and tend to reside in the houses of the fallen ones. They are easily angered and suffer diseases of the oral cavity. If beneficent, Rahu in the second house ensures monetary gains. This is from the text Phaladipak and Sarvata Chintamani. Now, each of these is a claim made by a text that calls itself a system of knowledge. There is no reason out of hand to dismiss any of these assertions. The incidence and distribution of a bunch of traits and attributes in a given population and their correlative association with a certain celestial ordering of planets at the time of birth could be the subject of an excellent prospective or retrospective observational study. The only requirements would be clearly defined variables and a control group that is outside the control of the aforesaid planets. Parashara, the patron savant of Vedic astrology, in his Brihat Parashara Horoshastra, chapter 81, verse 47, says the following. If Mars, Mangal, is placed in the lagna, the 12th, 4th, 7th, and 8th houses, without any aspect or conjunction of the benefic, the favorable planets, the husband of such a woman will certainly have an early death. For the martial affliction, Mangal Dosh, to be cancelled and the Mangalik, non-Mangalik marriage to not end in the death of the spouse, there is a remedy. The woman has to first marry a banana or a peepal tree and then go ahead with the actual nuptials. For this to be true, first, the association must be demonstrated beyond reasonable doubt. That early spousal death will result when two individuals with birth charts of the above description marry. And then Causality must be evinced, that mass, and mass alone, in a certain alignment at the time of birth, is the cause of the death, the cause of the maleficence. Now, I ask you this. How would someone with a scientific temper respond to this? They'll start with the assumption, as they should, that there's no reason to dismiss this out of hand. Then they'll ask the following. What characteristics of an association must one consider before concluding that the most likely interpretation of it is causation? That something caused something else. For instance, cigarette smoke leads to coronary artery disease and heart attacks. So what characteristics of an association must one consider? Temporality, that exposure precedes the outcome. Strength, the stronger the association, the more likely that it is causal. Consistency, that it is repeatedly observed by different persons in different places, different circumstances, different times. Specificity, that a single putative cause produces a specific effect. Everything except plausibility. It isn't necessary that the association agrees with the currently accepted understanding of nature's processes. That's a feature we cannot demand. What seems plausible depends on the knowledge of the day. Percival Pott, for instance, in the 18th century could establish an association between sweeping chimneys and scrotal cancer. The mortality of chimney sweeps from scrotal cancer was 200 times that of workers who were not exposed to any tar or mineral oils. In the 18th century, it was a seemingly absurd association, quite outside the province of reality, of plausibility. In August 1883, a volcano violently erupted on the island of Krakatoa in the Dutch East Indies. Eruptions of ash reached an altitude of 20 kilometers in the sky. Explosions were heard as far away as Mauritius and Western Australia and caused multiple tsunamis. 1883. A prodigious load of sulfur dioxide was discharged into the atmosphere and carried by winds all across the planet. The resultant cirrus clouds reflected most of the sunlight. The skies darkened everywhere on Earth for many, many years. A bluish halo called the Bishop's Ring began to be seen around the sun. Summer temperatures fell by a couple of degrees. Sulfate aerosols remained in the stratosphere almost till 1889, causing spectacular, flaring, scarlet-orange sunrises and sunsets throughout the land. In the seasons after 1883, a dramatic surge in the incidence of rickets was noted in the dark, squalid, urban, coal-fueled centres of England. That's when Theobald Palm made the association between the crippled child and scant sunlight. The association that skeletal deformities, bow legs, knock knees, and thickened wrists and ankles could have something to do with the privation of the light of day. All inquiry starts with the careful observation of the world around us. The French statistician Michel Gauquelin conducted several empirical studies on the capacity of celestial bodies to govern human and terrestrial matters. His test of opposed destinies invited astrologers to evaluate and examine 40 birth charts and asked them to separate those of 20 criminals from 20 responsible citizens. Their results were entirely in line with the play of chance. In 1955, curiously, he published his signal monograph on his discovery of a series of highly significant statistical correlations between planetary positions and the birth times of eminently successful people. His findings actually startled Gauquelin himself and others of his fraternity. He wrote, "One of the strongest correlations I have observed is that sports champions tend to be born when the planet Mars is either rising or setting in the sky." He called it the Mars effect. Bensky et al., from the Committee for the Study of Paranormal Phenomena in 1994, conducted a massive independent study about this. And they followed Gauquelin's prescribed protocols. They did it on about more than 1,000 French sports champions and found absolutely no evidence of a Mars effect controlling or even marking the birth of eminent sports champions. The effect, they said, was attributable to a bias in Gauquelin's data selection process. That put an end to the Mars effect. Percy Seymour, in the late 90s, while he was still an astrophysicist at Plymouth, approached childbirth nativity from the other end. He produced a slightly twisted hypothesis on the time of birth. According to Seymour, a series of biological clocks in the fetus, in the unborn child, are synchronized by the magnetic field of the Earth, which is a factor of the magnetic field of the Sun and affected by planetary and lunar positions, he said. And this has the effect of causing a countdown to birth, telling the fetus when it ought to come out. He said if ocean-dwelling bacteria use the magnetic field to search for food, birds and fish use it to navigate, so why not human fetuses? Planetary alignments at the natural birth of the child, therefore, label the inherited genetic characteristics of the child, according to Seymour. His contention was that while the signs in the sky that preside over birth have no power to form our attributes, they do, and they can, however, mark them. Percy Seymour's theory was assaulted soundly from all quarters. The American astronomer Seth Shostak rubbished it by saying, "You'd experience a far greater magnetic field from the lights in the washing machine in your house than you would from Jupiter." So in India, the terminus where we find ourselves in is something like this. A few years ago, an appeal under the Act that bans false advertising was dismissed by the Mumbai High Court by stating that the Act does not cover astrology and related sciences. The Union government had put on record an affidavit that as a trusted science being practiced for over 4,000 years, astrology does not fall under the purview of the Drugs and Magical Remedies Objectionable Advertisements Act 1954. The Act defines magic remedy as any talisman, mantra, amulet, or any other object which is claimed to have miraculous powers to cure, diagnose, prevent, or mitigate a disease in humans. But about a fourth of Vedic astrology is touted as the science of prognostication and intercession in matters of health and disease. It is touted as the science of disease being caused by the influence of malefic planets and health being restored and preserved by benefic planets. The science of dispensing sapphire and the Shani Yantra pendant for impotence, or prescribing an offering of meaty rotis to cows on Fridays, or the donation of yellow articles to priests for pacifying a malefic Jupiter to manage diabetes, or the promise of the people tree intervention to obstruct death due to Mangal Dosh. All of this has complete immunity from prosecution and legal action, even if found to be patently fraudulent and ineffective. There has to be some consensus on what the scientific process is all about. It was Karl Popper, the Austrian philosopher, who gave us at least one of the fundamentals of the scientific method. You don't prove a scientific hypothesis right, he said. You try and prove it wrong. It has to be testable, refutable, and falsifiable. Vedic astrology, I'm afraid, like all other kinds of astrology, fails to fulfill the basic requirements of scientific theory. It fails on the first principle of testability. Real outcomes do not conform to predicted outcomes. This hallowed 4,000-year-old discipline fails to demonstrate the association of any human attribute with any configuration of celestial objects. Mere enunciation of a set of rules about houses and trees, lagna, and so on doesn't make it science. How were these hypotheses generated? Where are the observations that bear out these assertions? Will an observational study on the Mangal Shukra Yoga, for instance, stand scrutiny? If we are so wrought by the stars, where's the evidence? In Pune, 27 leading astrologers, when supplied with 200 horoscopes of children under double-blind conditions, failed to determine intelligence based on a definition provided by them, using rules from their scriptures at a rate higher than chance. They've even failed to determine the sex of the child at a rate higher than chance. Numerous tests have been done on multiple occasions where astrologers were asked to match the personal information, which included general interests, vocations, personality traits, and photographs of test cases with birth information and natal charts. On every occasion, they failed to perform any better than randomly picked non-astrologer controlled subjects. All superstition is the unfounded assignment of cause and effect, a false story about the world given to the credulous, making us pigeons from Skinner's study on operant conditioning. For the uninitiated, the Harvard psychologist B.F. Skinner once had an experiment involving caged pigeons who were given food at random intervals. They soon started displaying ritualized behaviors, as though they believed that their actions were causing the food to arrive. That's precisely what astrology does to us. Astrology is the worst kind of superstition, the most stultifying and solipsistic one, that makes us believe that the stars and the planetary plasmas are all about us. The spell of its clerical class has to be broken. They have to be called out to impugn the manner in which they scientize their claims. How is it that this form of subjection and abjection plays a central role in our way of life? Why do so many of us have birth charts? Why are they brought out to check for compatibility before a wedding is fixed? And what about, before I end, the ethics of the Muhurat Caesarean? Do we humor these women and their families indulgently? From the time the scalpel was first used to section the lower segment of the uterus in the non-laboring woman, we have it within our means to determine the exact moment of birth. If there are going to be non-clinical factors that influence the choice of caesarean section as a method of obstetric delivery, if there is such a thing as a caesarean on maternal request, the principle of patient autonomy would mandate the permissibility of a Muhurat caesarean in a normal pregnancy. If it can be performed on considerations of pain and vaginal tone and convenience, then why not on the doctrine of fate and the creed that the character and personality of the neonate are irrevocably formed by the grahas at the moment of birth, if that's what the mother wants to believe? Wouldn't it come under the clause of fetal and maternal well-being? Well, consider this. A high proportion of elective caesareans tend to be performed at or before 39 weeks of gestation, before the onset of labor. There's enough evidence that infants born before 39 weeks are at an increased risk for adverse respiratory outcomes. Clearly, pre-labor elective caesareans aren't harmless. For all that and more, one cannot condemn one kind of maternal request without condemning the other. And then, as I had explained, there's the specter of the morbidly adherent placenta, the one that makes the womb bleed inexorably. One way or the other, in this mortal coil, we're all Schrodinger's cats. Thank you.